Imagine being 18 years old and suddenly being told that you are now the queen of one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world. You are young. You have never ruled a country. You have never experienced the enormous pressure of a crown. And suddenly millions of people are looking toward you. This was the extraordinary beginning of Queen Victoria's story. Victoria was born on the 24th of May 1819 at Kensington Palace. Her father died when she was still a baby. Because of this, Victoria grew up under the strict control of her mother and her advisors. Her childhood was extremely restricted. She was rarely allowed to be alone. She was carefully watched. Her education was controlled. And almost every part of her daily life was supervised. But Victoria was determined. She wanted independence. She wanted to make her own decisions. And one day she would finally have the power to do exactly that. On the 20th of June 1837, King William IV died. Victoria was now queen. She was only 18 years old. When the news reached her, she understood that her life would never be the same again. The young queen moved into Buckingham Palace. She began meeting ministers. She attended official ceremonies. She studied political affairs. And she slowly learned what it meant to rule Britain. The country she inherited was changing rapidly. The Industrial Revolution was transforming cities. Factories were growing. Railways were beginning to connect Britain. London was becoming a huge modern city. And the British Empire was expanding around the world. Victoria understood that she could no longer remain the sheltered girl of Kensington Palace. She had to become a monarch. She had to make difficult decisions. She had to deal with politicians. And she had to represent millions of people. But while Victoria was learning how to rule, there was another important part of her life waiting to begin. Love. Victoria had known Prince Albert since childhood. He was her first cousin. He was intelligent, musical, well-educated, and ambitious. When Albert returned to Britain in 1839, Victoria was immediately attracted to him. But there was one important difference between them. Victoria was the queen. Albert would become her husband. He would never become her ruler. Victoria understood this completely. And she wanted the marriage. She proposed to Albert herself. On the 10th of February 1840, Queen Victoria married Prince Albert. She was 20 years old. Albert was also 20. Their marriage became one of the most famous royal relationships in British history. Victoria was deeply in love with him. Albert became much more than her husband. He became her closest companion, her advisor, and the person she trusted most. Together they created a large family. They eventually had 9 children. Victoria and Albert also became symbols of a new kind of royal family. They supported education, science, art, industry, and technological progress. Albert played an important role in the Great Exhibition of 1851. The exhibition celebrated Britain's industrial achievements and attracted visitors from around the world. For Victoria and Albert, it represented a new future. Britain was changing. Technology was changing. And the monarchy was changing with it. For more than 20 years, Victoria and Albert built a life together. They had a family. They had responsibilities. They had public duties. And they had each other. Victoria had finally found someone she trusted completely. But she could not know that this happiness would not last forever. Because in 1861, the man she loved would suddenly become seriously ill. And the queen, who had spent her entire life learning how to control the future, would soon discover that there were some things even a queen could not control. The year 1861 began like many other years for Queen Victoria. She was still the powerful young queen of Britain. Prince Albert was still beside her. Their children were growing older and their family was becoming one of the most important royal families in Europe. Britain itself was changing rapidly. Factories were growing. Railways were expanding. Cities were becoming larger. And Victoria believed that Albert would remain her partner for many more years. But then everything changed. Prince Albert became seriously ill. At first Victoria hoped that he would recover. He was only 42 years old. He still had plans for the future. He wanted to continue helping Britain. He wanted to guide their children. And most importantly, he wanted to remain beside Victoria. But his condition became worse. Victoria became increasingly frightened. She stayed close to him. She watched the man she loved become weaker. And then in December 1861 the tragedy happened. Prince Albert died. He was only 42 years old. Victoria was completely devastated. The man who had been beside her for more than 20 years was suddenly gone. He was not only her husband. He was her closest companion, her advisor, her trusted friend, and the person she believed understood her better than anyone else. Victoria could not accept the loss. She withdrew from public life. She stopped appearing regularly at official ceremonies. She spent long periods away from London. And she began wearing black. At first the British public understood her grief. But the months became years. And Victoria continued to mourn Albert. She kept his rooms exactly as they had been. His clothes were preserved. His personal belongings remained in their places. His servants were instructed to continue preparing his room. Every morning his room was maintained as though Albert might still return. But he never did. Victoria's grief became part of her daily life. She often visited Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. It had been a special place for Victoria and Albert. There she could escape the pressure of London. She could walk through rooms filled with memories. She could remember the family they had built. And she could mourn away from the public eye. But Britain needed its queen. The country was changing. Politics was changing. The British Empire was expanding. And the public expected Victoria to return to her responsibilities. Soon newspapers began criticizing her. People asked why their queen remained hidden. Why was she not appearing in public? Why was she not showing herself to the people? Some even questioned whether the monarchy could remain strong while Victoria stayed away from public life. Victoria was deeply hurt by the criticism. She believed that people did not understand her pain. She had lost the man she loved. And she refused to pretend that his death did not matter. She continued wearing black. The black dress slowly became part of her identity. People began to recognize her as the grieving queen, the Widow of Windsor. But Victoria's story was not going to end with grief. Slowly, very slowly, she began returning to public life. She realized that she could continue loving Albert. She could continue remembering him. And at the same time she could continue ruling Britain. She did not have to forget him in order to move forward. She only had to learn how to live with the loss. And as Victoria slowly returned to her responsibilities, Britain entered one of the most extraordinary periods in its history, an age that would eventually carry her own name, the Victorian Age. But the queen who entered this new era was no longer the young woman who had become queen at 18. She was now a widow, a mother, a powerful monarch, and a woman carrying a grief that would remain with her for the rest of her life. After the death of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's life had changed forever. She was no longer the young queen who had entered Buckingham Palace at 18. She was now a widow, a mother, and a monarch carrying a deep personal loss. But Britain could not stop. The country continued to change. The Industrial Revolution was transforming everyday life. Factories were becoming larger. Railways were spreading across the country. Steamships were making international travel faster. And London was becoming one of the greatest cities in the world. New inventions were appearing. Science was advancing. Photography was becoming popular. And the telegraph was allowing messages to travel across enormous distances. Victoria's reign became closely connected with all of these changes. Her name became attached to an entire period of British history, the Victorian Age. But while Britain was becoming more modern, Victoria remained deeply connected to the memory of Albert. She continued wearing black. She continued keeping his belongings. And she continued remembering the advice he had once given her. For Victoria, Albert was never simply a person from the past. He remained part of her daily life. But slowly, the Queen began to understand that her responsibilities could not disappear with her husband. She had a country to rule. She had ministers to meet. She had important decisions to make. And she had a royal family that depended upon her. Victoria had 9 children. Her family eventually became connected with royal houses across Europe. Her children married princes and princesses from different countries. Her grandchildren became part of European royalty. Because of this, Victoria eventually became known as the grandmother of Europe. But being a mother was not always easy for the Queen. She loved her children. Yet she could also be extremely demanding. She worried about their marriages, their health, their political connections, and their futures. She wanted to protect them. But sometimes her protection became control. Her children often struggled to live under the expectations of their powerful mother. Still, the royal family remained one of Victoria's greatest achievements. She had created a family that connected Britain with many European royal houses. And as the years passed, Victoria's own position became even more powerful. In 1876, she received another remarkable title, Empress of India. The title reflected the enormous size and importance of the British Empire. Victoria became closely associated with the empire. Her portrait appeared throughout Britain and across imperial territories. She collected objects from India. She became interested in Indian culture. And later in life she developed a remarkable relationship with an Indian servant named Abdul Karim. Abdul arrived in Britain in 1887 during Victoria's Golden Jubilee. He had originally been sent to serve the Queen. But Victoria quickly became interested in him. She wanted to learn more about India. Abdul taught her Hindustani. He introduced her to Indian customs. And Victoria eventually made him her munshi, her teacher. The relationship became controversial inside the royal household. Some members of the family were uncomfortable with Abdul's growing influence. Some servants also disliked the closeness between him and the Queen. But Victoria defended him. She had spent much of her life being told what she should do. Now she was an experienced queen. And she was determined to make her own decisions. As the years continued, Victoria became one of the most recognizable women in the world. She had ruled for decades. She had survived political challenges. She had experienced personal tragedy. And she had watched Britain transform around her. But time was moving forward. The young Queen of 1837 was becoming an elderly monarch. The 19th century was slowly approaching its end. And Victoria was approaching the final chapter of her extraordinary life. But before her story ended, she would leave behind a legacy that would influence Britain for generations to come. By the final decades of her reign, Queen Victoria had become one of the most famous women in the world. She had ruled Britain for more than 60 years. For many people, she was not simply their queen. She was the only monarch they had ever known. Her face appeared in newspapers. Her portraits were displayed across Britain. Her name appeared on buildings. And her image became connected with an entire era. But behind the public image, Victoria remained a woman carrying the memory of Prince Albert. More than 30 years had passed since his death. Yet she still remembered him. She continued wearing black. She continued keeping his belongings. And she continued to speak about him with affection. The world around Victoria was changing faster than ever. Electric lights were beginning to transform cities. Telephones were becoming possible. New forms of transportation were appearing. Photography was becoming more advanced. And newspapers were reaching millions of people. Victoria had witnessed an extraordinary transformation. When she became queen, Britain was still largely dependent on horses and sailing ships. Now the country was entering the modern industrial world. But Victoria herself was growing old. Her eyesight was becoming weaker. Her health was declining. And she found it increasingly difficult to move without assistance. Yet she continued working. She still read important documents. She still met government officials. She still followed political affairs. and she remained deeply involved in the lives of her children and grandchildren. Her family had become enormous. Her descendants were connected to royal families throughout Europe. But Victoria's private life remained complicated. She could be loving and affectionate, yet she could also be demanding. She often worried about her children. She wanted to control their marriages. She wanted to know about their health. And she wanted to remain involved in their decisions. Her personality was strong. And even in old age she continued to have a powerful presence. But the world she had ruled was changing. The 19th century was coming to an end. New political ideas were spreading. Society was changing. Britain was facing new challenges. And a new generation was preparing to take the throne. Victoria had been queen since 1837. She had ruled through almost an entire lifetime. She had witnessed the growth of the British Empire. She had seen cities become industrial centers. She had watched technology change communication. And she had watched her children grow into adults. But now, the Queen was approaching the end of her own life. In January 1901, Victoria travelled to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. She was seriously ill. Her family gathered around her. The woman who had ruled Britain for more than 63 years was now nearing the end. News of her condition spread quickly. People across Britain waited. People across the empire waited. For generations Victoria had been part of their lives. Her death would not simply mean the loss of a monarch. It would mean the end of an era. On the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died. She was 81 years old. Her reign had lasted 63 years and 7 months. The Victorian Age had reached its final moment. Britain was now entering the 20th century. A new king would take the throne. A new generation would lead the country. And the world that Victoria had known was slowly becoming history. But her story was not completely over. The funeral of the Queen would become one of the most extraordinary royal events Britain had ever witnessed. And after 40 years of living without Prince Albert, Victoria was finally going to return to the man she had never stopped loving. The death of Queen Victoria marked the end of an extraordinary era. For more than 63 years she had ruled Britain. She had become queen as an 18-year-old girl. And now she had died as one of the longest reigning monarchs in British history. When the news of her death spread across Britain, people gathered in the streets. Many had never known another monarch. For them, Queen Victoria had always been part of British life. Her name was connected with the country itself. Her reign had witnessed enormous changes. Railways had crossed Britain. Factories had transformed cities. New technologies had changed communication. The British Empire had expanded across the world. And society had entered the modern age. But for Victoria's family, her death was deeply personal. She had been a mother, a grandmother, and the center of a huge royal family. Her funeral became a major national event. Crowds gathered along the streets to watch the final journey of the Queen. Soldiers marched. Royal representatives arrived from across Europe. And millions followed the events through newspapers. After decades of public life, Victoria was finally leaving the stage. But there was something deeply symbolic about where she would be laid to rest. She would be buried beside Prince Albert, the man she had loved, the man whose death had changed her life. For 40 years Victoria had lived without him. For 40 years she had worn black. For 40 years she had kept his memory alive. She had preserved his rooms. She had kept his belongings. She had continued to speak about him. And she had never allowed herself to completely forget the life they had shared. Now they would finally be together again. Victoria was laid to rest beside Albert at the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore. After 40 years apart, the Queen and her beloved husband were reunited. It was a fitting ending to one of the most emotional royal stories in British history. But Victoria's legacy was much larger than her grief. She had ruled during one of the greatest periods of transformation Britain had ever experienced. She had witnessed the Industrial Revolution, the expansion of the railways, the rise of modern cities, the development of new technologies, the growth of newspapers, the expansion of the British Empire, and the transformation of the British monarchy. Her children and grandchildren became connected with royal families across Europe. Her descendants eventually became part of the history of several European monarchies, and her name became attached to an entire age, the Victorian Age. But perhaps the most fascinating part of Victoria's story is not the size of her empire. It is the woman behind the crown. She was once a young girl who had almost no freedom. Then she became queen. She found love. She built a family. She lost the man she loved. And she spent the rest of her life carrying his memory. The world expected Victoria to move on after Albert's death. But she refused to forget him. Her black clothing became a symbol of mourning. But it also became a symbol of loyalty. She showed the world that grief could remain part of a person's life, even while that person continued to work, even while that person continued to rule, even while history continued moving forward. Victoria never stopped being a queen. But she also never stopped being a widow. That is what made her story so unusual. Behind the crown was a woman. Behind the empire was a wife. Behind the black dress was a memory of a man named Albert. When Victoria finally died in 1901, she was placed beside him. The woman who had spent 40 years mourning him was finally at peace. Queen Victoria was not only the monarch who ruled Britain for more than 63 years. She was the woman who gave her name to an entire era. She was the queen who watched Britain become modern. She was the mother of a royal dynasty. She was the empress connected to a vast empire. But most of all, she was a woman who experienced great love and great loss. Her crown represented power. Her empire represented influence. But her black dress told another story. A story about devotion, memory, and a love that survived death. This was the story of Queen Victoria, the young queen who found love, the wife who lost it, and the widow in black who never forgot.